For basically all of human history, one of the biggest mysteries out there was how life passes its secrets from one generation to the next. Now, the answer didn't come from some famous professor in a fancy, state-of-the-art lab. Nope, it came from a monk working quietly in a monastery garden. This is the incredible story of how he cracked the code of life itself.
For centuries, this was the question. I mean, everybody knew that kids look like their parents, right? But the actual how was a complete black box. Was it a blending of blood? Some kind of mixing of essences? The greatest minds had all sorts of theories, but nobody had any real proof.
And the solution came from the most unexpected place you can imagine. Not some big, grand university, but the quiet, humble garden of the St. Thomas Abbey in what was then the Austrian Empire. And the person who figured it all out was a man named Gregor Mendel.
So, to really understand his amazing discovery, we have to understand the man himself. His journey was, well, anything but ordinary. It was forged by poverty, by sacrifice, and by a totally unique intellectual environment that prepared him, and maybe only him, to see what everyone else had been missing.
Mendel came from some seriously humble beginnings. He was a farmer's son, so he knew plants and grafting from the time he was a kid. But his dream of getting an education was a constant struggle against what he himself called bitter food worries. And get this, in this incredible act of family sacrifice, his younger sister actually gave up her own dowry just to help pay for his studies. He eventually joined the abbey, not just for spiritual reasons, but for a really practical one. It was the only way he could keep studying without the perpetual anxiety of being poor.
Now, what's so crucial to understand is that this abbey wasn't some quiet retreat from the world. It was a hotbed of scientific inquiry. The abbot himself, a guy named Cyril Knapp, was obsessed with things like improving local agriculture and sheep breeding. Years before Mendel even started his experiments, his boss was already asking the exact right questions about heredity. Talk about being in the right place at the right time.
But here's Mendel's secret weapon. He got an education that pretty much no other biologist of his time had. The Abbey sent him to the University of Vienna, where he was trained in two totally different worlds. From the physicist Christian Doppler, he learned to think in terms of math and probability and discrete countable things. And from the botanist Franz Unger, he learned all about cell theory and how plants vary. So he was basically trained to see the patterns of biology through the sharp lens of physics.
Okay. So armed with this completely unique perspective, Mendel went back to the monastery garden and began this incredibly meticulous, 7-year-long experiment that would, well, change science forever.
His genius really started with his choice of subject, the common pea plant. Now, where other people saw this confusing mess of traits, Mendel focused on just 7 characteristics that were clear, simple, binary choices. A plant was either tall or dwarf. Its seeds were either round or wrinkled. There was no in-between. And this simplification, this was absolutely the key.
His method was just as elegant. First, he controlled everything. I mean, he painstakingly cross-pollinated these plants with a tiny little brush to make sure he knew the exact parents of every single seed. Second, he isolated just one trait at a time. And third, and this was the real breakthrough, he counted. He counted everything. He ended up documenting over 28,000 plants, turning biology into a numbers game.
And after years and years of all this meticulous counting, one simple, powerful ratio just kept showing up, again and again. It was like a secret code whispering the rules of life. 3 to 1.
So when he crossed his hybrid plants, something amazing happened. The recessive trait, like wrinkled seeds, which had totally vanished in that first generation, it always came back in the second, and it always reappeared in that same unmistakable ratio. For every one wrinkled seed, there were about 3 round ones. The consistency across thousands of plants was just undeniable. This wasn't random chance. This was a law of nature.
Mendel's 3-to-1 ratio just completely destroyed the old idea of blending inheritance. You know, the theory that traits were like paint mixing together into some intermediate shade. No. He proposed they were passed down in these discrete individual packages, what he called factors and what we now call genes. One factor could be dominant and it could mask the other one, but that recessive factor was never lost. It was just hidden, ready to pop back up in a future generation.
So he had discovered the fundamental laws of heredity. He published his work in 1866. And then, nothing. Crickets. So how did one of the greatest breakthroughs in the history of science get completely lost for an entire generation?
Well, part of the problem was his follow-up experiment.
A skeptical botanist encouraged him to try and replicate his findings in a plant called hawkweed, but the results were a total confusing mess that seemed to contradict his laws. It was a crushing setback. What Mendel couldn't possibly have known was that hawkweed was the worst possible choice. Many species of it reproduce asexually, basically cloning themselves, which completely bypasses the laws of heredity he had just discovered. His theory wasn't wrong, he just picked a plant that was playing by a totally different set of rules.
Soon after that, Mendel was elected abbot of his monastery. His time was just consumed by administrative duties and this bitter, decade-long tax dispute with the government. His scientific work ground to a halt. He died in 1884, totally convinced his work was important, but completely unrecognized by the world. His paper just sat unread in libraries for a generation.
But the story doesn't end there. Oh no. 34 years later, the world was finally ready for Gregor Mendel.
In what has to be one of the most remarkable coincidences in scientific history, in the year 1900, 3 different scientists in 3 different countries, Hugo de Vries, Carl Correns, and Erich von Chermach, all independently did similar experiments and came to the exact same conclusions. And when they went to search the literature to see if anyone had done it before, they were absolutely stunned to find that some obscure monk had discovered it all over 3 decades earlier.
The rediscovery was explosive. An English biologist named William Bateson became its greatest champion, and he even coined a new word for this brand new field of study: genetics. Mendel's lost work became the foundation of a whole scientific revolution.
But the ultimate validation of Mendel's work, the final proof, wouldn't come for another century. It required technology he could never have even dreamed of. Technology that lets us connect his simple garden observations directly to the molecular code of DNA itself.
And this is just incredible. We have now identified the actual genes behind Mendel's 7 traits. The difference between a tall plant and a dwarf plant, it comes down to a single letter change in a gene that produces growth hormone. Those wrinkled seeds, that's caused by a mutation in a starch branching enzyme. His abstract factors are real, tangible sequences in the pea's DNA. It's just mind-blowing. And then, in what has to be the most fitting tribute imaginable, on the 200th anniversary of his birth, scientists actually exhumed Mendel's remains from his tomb. The father of genetics was about to have his own genome sequenced.
And the results were fascinating. First, they confirmed it was really him by matching the DNA to a hair found in one of his old books. They found he carried genetic variants linked to heart problems, which suggests he probably died of a heart attack, not the kidney disease on his death certificate. And they even found variants linked to neurological conditions, which might give us a biological reason for the severe stress and the nervous breakdowns he was known to have suffered from throughout his life.
So in the end, Mendel's own discovery reached back through time to tell his story. The monk who gave us the tools to understand our biological inheritance had his own health, his own struggles, even the cause of his death, illuminated by that very same science. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What secrets about our own lives are still waiting to be read from the code he first taught us how to decipher?